Tonight I want to continue the series we started last week on the Father's gift. And I want to start with a poem that I found this afternoon that I thought was worthy of our reading it. And the title of the poem is When Daddy Prays. When Daddy prays, he doesn't use the words the preacher does. There's different things for different days, but mostly it's for us. When Daddy prays, the house is still. His voice is slow and deep. We shut our eyes, the clock ticks loud, so quiet we must keep. He prays that we may be good boys, and later on good men. And then we squirm and think we won't have any quarrels again. You'd never think to look at Dad. He once had temper too. I guess if Daddy needs to pray, we youngsters see in time we'll need to. Sometimes the prayer gets very long and hard to understand. And then I wiggle up quite closely and let him hold my hand. I can't remember all of it. I'm little yet, you see. But one thing I cannot forget is my daddy prays for me. I just thought that was kind of a tremendous idea and a tremendous thought, worthy of us understanding it. It's better than a poem my daddy wrote for a guy that was kin to him, that was coming down time to die, had bragged all of his life about not being a child of God, not being faithful to the Lord. His last name started with D, as in danger. And the poem Daddy wrote went this way. To introduce myself, I'm Mr. D. The next lines that follow are all about me. For the 81 years that God has let me live, not a thing in return to him did I give. I made a few friends, put some money in the bank, entertained myself with the beer that I drank. But these hands work for me and not for the Lord. And my earthly wealth was my only reward. When you walk by my casket, look down in my face, you'll see a man that rejected God's grace. My lips, still in death, were used to profane instead of revering my Maker's name. My clothes will be carefully and delicately arranged with care. Won't mean a thing to me, I know, 'cause I'll be all dressed up with no place to go. There's a lot of times that people misunderstand the gift of the Father. One of the major gifts is something that I have tried to help people understand over the years. Sometimes they have and sometimes they haven't. The Bible says, for the whom the Lord loves, he chasteneth, and scourgeth every son whom he receives. For God deals with us as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline or chasten? But if you are without discipline, of which all have become partakers, then you are bastards and not children. All discipline for the moment seems not to be joyous, but sorrowful. Yet to those who have been exercised thereby, it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness. I've read a whole lot of books in my time at school and afterward on how to raise children. I know that there are people who've written books that'll tell you how And they'll explain it to you. But the only one that I know that you should pay much attention to is God. God certainly understands the proper value of discipline. But he does not understand one who is mean and indifferent to the ones that he brings into the world. Some treat children as though they are illegitimate. That is, they don't seem to care as a father, and they don't have any confidence in them as children. Too often discipline is left to the mother because dad's just too busy or too tired when he comes home from work to take such trivial matters in hand. Dad, don't be too busy for your children. We remember an example of a godly man named Eli who neglected a vital part of his parenting. If you'll turn to 1 Samuel, the 3rd chapter, the 11th through the 14th verse, let me read for you. Eli was the high priest of Israel, and he had 2 sons, Phinehas and Hophni. And they were just rabble-rousers and problems. He just couldn't get them to mind. They wouldn't obey him for anything. In fact, they were so illegitimate, they propositioned women when they came to offer sacrifices. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Behold, I'm about to do a thing in Israel at which both ears of everyone who hear it will tingle. In that day I will carry out against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house from the beginning to the end. For I've told him that I'm about to judge his house, because his sons brought a curse on themselves, and he did not rebuke them. Therefore I have sworn to the house of Eli that the iniquity shall not be atoned for by sacrifice or offering." I don't know if you know the story of Eli and the story of his 2 sons, but it ended in a disastrous situation for all the above. Phinehas and Hophni were killed, and when they came to tell Eli about the death of his sons, he was sitting on a log. And when he sat on that log and heard of this, he fell backwards and broke his neck and died. How would you like to be awakened one night after you've been asleep and you find out that you're going to be judged by the way you have raised your children? This is one of the most permissive things that has been in our society for a long time. But if you got a pencil and a piece of paper, I want you to write down a truism that is absolutely, without question, undeniable. It goes like this: what I permit, I promote. There's a whole lot of people complain to me about their children talking back to them. They want to know why every time they tell them to do something and they turn around, little Johnny or little Ed is running his mouth. The only reason I know that little Johnny or little Ed's running his mouth is when that got started, it was permitted to continue. And because it wasn't corrected, both children, or all the children that are involved in this, decided they would push the envelope as far as they could push it. And so every time Daddy or Mama told them to do something, when they were walking off the other way, they were talking. When I raised my children, I was hard of hearing, but I could hear this 50 feet away. And I knew that this was a sign of rebellion that had to be taken out of the heart of the children in order for them to be citizens in the kingdom of heaven. Because once this begins, it doesn't stay in an isolated place. When a child is able to speak back, talk back, with disrespect to his parents, it is only because of one thing. Somebody will say he heard his mama do it. Well, that may be true, but that may not be true. The real truth is because he was allowed to. You see, once it's allowed, it's permitted. Once it's permitted, you condone it. I was standing outside here one Sunday morning, and we were all standing out there talking before the services began. This man was standing out talking to us, and up came his little daughter. She was a pretty little thing. She looked about 9, 10 years old, dressed in some nice-looking clothes. But she was mad at a guy she called the old man. Now, my daddy never called or allowed us to call him the old man, because the only person who was ever called the old man in the Bible was the devil. And he sure wasn't going to take that. But she walked up to her father, and with her pretty white pointed shoes, reared back and kicked him right in the shins. You say that don't hurt? I've never been kicked in my life by anything or anybody, dull or sharp pointed, that it wouldn't hurt. His wife was standing by, and all of a sudden she hollered out this man's name, Henry! That meant that Henry couldn't do anything to teach his daughter a little respect. 18 years came and went. Henry's wife passed away, but his daughter was still with us. One day his daughter entered the house with a knife. And because Henry wouldn't do what she wanted to do, which was to give her some money that she had no right to have, she took that knife and slit his throat. When I heard about this, I wondered if his wife was hollering at that time. I can't get the point across too straight. What you permit, you promote. When you tell a child to do something, it is something that you have been given a position by God to be put in that place to tell. It is true that the Bible says, train up a child in the way it should go, and when it's old, it won't depart. This word train means to cause it to be quieted, to cause it to be one who is obedient to direction. Now, your wife may tell you that you can't correct your children, but for all of you people who are brothers in the cause of Christ, I have to tell you one thing you may not know. God will judge you by the way you raise them. It's not what she wants, it's what God wants. It's not what she says, it's what God says. My wife and I had an agreement as we were raising our children. We didn't always disagree, and that was very unusual because 99% of the time we did. But when we didn't, we had some hand signals that we used. The hand signals meant two things. One, you get to where the child can't see you, and you tell me why that you don't think they should be corrected. That worked greatly. Because when the child thinks the parents are fighting and they see that division, that divisiveness is just the clue that they need to know they can continue to get away with what they want to do. And of course, all they want's their way anyway. They're children. Who's taught them any better? You remember when it cried for a bottle, what you did? Remember when it cried for its diaper to be changed, what you did? Remember when it cried for its favorite food, what you did? We've trained them that way, folks. We gave them everything that we could give them that we knew that they wanted. But what we can't do is break the law of God. David said, I once was young, and now I'm old. And I've never seen the righteous forsaken, nor their seed begging bread. There's a lot of times that the Lord has caused us to understand our position as fathers in the home. And the home is that which God has established, like we talked about last week. It was the father that God put in the home to train up your children, to teach them the law of God. Deuteronomy 6, when you're walking in the street, when you're sitting at the table, as you lay down at night, in every aspect of which you are involved, it is the father's responsibility to train the child. Now, if my wife and I didn't disagree, we had another agreement. She respected me and I respected her. But there's one thing we both respected, was that if I was going to be judged by the way the children were raised, if we disagreed, I got to make the decision. Because it was my soul on the line. It was me that God would judge. This was the plan that God had from the beginning. Permissiveness is interpreted by children a lot of times as okay. Sometimes it's even brought about by some people at some times as rejection. There's a lot of times when the father or the mother seems to not know little Johnny's on the place. And so when little Johnny's not seen to be on the place, he wants some attention. And one of the ways he gets attention is to draw attention to himself. Don't want to find any objections from people whose children are disobedient or out of the way. But when they want attention and you're giving attention to everything else but them, and they get out of line or out of order, they're going to find some way to draw your attention to them. A lot of times it's making noise, being rowdy, being what they know you don't want them to be. And yet, they're going to push you to the final level of your patience. And they've seen you tested and tried many times. And you can just about guarantee yourself that they know which way the cookie's going to crumble. Because they've tried over and over again. Then there's times when children get their parents in the public. My daddy took us aside years ago, and he said, "Now, I want you to know that I love you. But if you get me out in public and make a fool out of me in public, then in public I will act like a fool. If you don't do that, then we won't have any problems." And he said, as I'm spanking you, and that's a dangerous word in today's society. As I'm spanking you or disciplining you, there's one thing you can recount in your mind. As I'm hitting you, you say to yourself, "He loves me. He loves me. He loves me." But he said, if I don't do these things, I don't love you. Because I am raising you as a fool. And you have no respect for me in the home. You'll have no respect for God. And unfortunately, you'll probably have no respect for the government or the law of the land in which you live. And so in order to keep you from going to jail, I have to exercise what I really don't want to do. And that's that dreaded word called discipline. Now, Solomon is supposed to be one of the wisest men that ever lived. Everybody thinks Solomon's wise until it gets right down to the wisdom of Solomon. Solomon said, a man that won't discipline his child hates the child. Now you say, that's pretty strong language. Well, in the Hebrew language, that means he loves himself less than he should love him. and that a person who is not disciplined is not loved. Yet we find that modern society has gone the other way. There's an old boy that wrote a book that decided that it was wrong for children to be corrected physically by their parents. Now, my mama was this great lady, and she had a demeanor about her that was quiet and nice. But Mom always carried a weapon with her. No, I'm not talking about a handgun. I'm talking about a little thin piece of a tree that she'd carry with her in her pocketbook, taken off of a limb. Usually, you know who got to go get that piece of lumber? She'd say, now, David, that's what she'd call me. That's what she gave me as a name. Everybody else calls me Joe David. She'd say, now, you go out and get me a limb off the tree. And you make sure you get me a good one. I don't want one that breaks. And if it does, you get to go get another one. And we'll work on this thing till we get it right. We'd come into the church services. She'd say, sit down. I wouldn't turn over and look at her and say, why? I wouldn't walk out toward the back of the building running my mouth, telling her I'm going to do what I want to. She didn't have the right to do that anyway. I wouldn't be one that would be directly involved in showing disrespect or disobedience to her in any way. You know why? You ever heard that phrase, behold, the judge cometh? I remember we were in church building one time in Greenville, Tennessee. And my older brother was a little harder headed than I. See, I knew that every time they hit you with a limb, it hurt. I never did figure that there was one time it would be done that it wouldn't hurt, but I guess he figured that it wouldn't work that way. So one thing you didn't do for my mom and daddy is run from them. Man, that was the worst curse you could ever get into. If they started at you to correct you and you took off and ran the other way, may God have mercy on your poor ignorant soul, because you're going to need it. She chased my brother for 4 blocks till he ran out of breath and she caught him. She turned him around and had that little switch in her hand, and she whipped him every step of the way back. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't check to see if somebody didn't like it or did like it. But I'm going to tell you what, I don't think as long as I was around the family, and my brother turned out to be 6'4" and weigh about 285 pounds, I don't think he ever ran from her again. Again, I'm going to go over this premise. What you permit, you promote. If you allow a child to be disobedient and disrespectful, it's not the child's fault. It's yours. Fathers, train up a child. You know what that word train means? I keep asking the question. There's a lot of people that don't know what train means. When I was a little boy, we used to train horses. When we trained horses, we went through a lot of maneuvers with food and everything else, although we don't do that with children. But we went through all these efforts to train them, with the way we put the bridle in their mouth, with the way we did put the saddle on their back, with the way, just 100 things it seemed like you just never got through. Usually when we went to a show, my grandfather was the director of affairs. His horses always took first place. They never broke gait. You know what I mean by that? They never went to the right when he said, go to the left. I'd tell you those terms in farmer terms, but you wouldn't understand them. They never ran wild, and they never got out of line. Somebody says, well, these horses must have been well trained. Now, there's a lot of people that don't understand that God has given them these children not as an experiment, not to cause them to not get what they want when they want it, but is to teach them to become citizens of the kingdom of God. And the gift that the Father has to give to his sons or his daughters is to train them. You say, well, I don't like to spank my children. Well, God recommends it. You're smarter than God. You use the pattern that you want. We were at a man's house one night, and we were about to eat supper. And I don't know what happened now. I was more interested in what was coming onto the table than I was the confusion that was going on. But he caused his son to leave the table and go to his bedroom until he could compose himself and come back and join the rest of us. It seemed to me like a difficult situation. Could have been handled real easy by him saying, son, you just follow me out behind the shed there a few minutes. We'll solve our problems. We'll be back and we'll all eat supper. Later on in life, this young man respected no man. No, not his father, nor his mother. They had condoned what they'd permitted. And when they permitted it, they had no discipline involved. I've often been told that the reason we have so much murder and mayhem in this country is because they know they're not going to go to the death chamber. Well, we've got people now that think that's a heinous crime. I mean, they could come out and bludgeon 15 or 20 or 30 or 40 people and spend 40 or 50 years in a jail cell, get 3 square meals a day, new clothes every month, have a fresh place to take a bath, and go to the places of relief, and do all of those things that they want, and they never ever worry about dying. They got some liberal, too good person that's going to tell you that you can't take their life. I read the Bible. The wisdom of God is what I follow. Now, if you'll turn back with me, and we used this verse this morning, if you'll turn back with me to Genesis 9, unless it's moved or unless it's changed, it still says the same thing. In Genesis 9 and 6, after Noah landed on Mount Ararat, God told Noah, I'm going to change the law. And it's going to read like this. Whosoever sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God made he man. We don't have the right to do these things. But I'm going to tell you, in the city of Chicago, they've killed more people than they did in one of the areas of activity during the Vietnam War. And nobody thinks anything about it. Why? Permission, because of no punishment, grants promotion. Now, I love my children. I never beat on one of them. I never caused one of them to go to the hospital with a black eye. I never had one of them that walked around having to wear their clothes down lower than they should have because they had stripes all over their legs. I never caused one of them to fear me when I walked in the door. In fact, unless their mother had told them that punishment was on his way, when I got home, they was glad to see me. I always could tell when things were wrong, though, when I'd walk in the door and they'd run like rats going in the barn. I knew there was a problem. She'd look at me and say, Joe, you got to whip Bobby. I wouldn't say a word. I wouldn't say, huh? Why? Are you sure? Let's argue with it. Let's talk about it. I just said, okay, Bobby, to your bedroom. I didn't know I was whipping him. It really didn't matter. What was mattering is that whatever she had told him, he hadn't done. And that couldn't be allowed, not for us, but for Bobby's sake. For you see, one of the great blessings that God has given us in the home is a disciplinary force that will cause us to respect, in the final analysis, God. If our children learn to disrespect, to talk back, to speak against what we're saying, what do you think they're going to do when it comes time for them as an adult to consider obeying the gospel? It's an often wonderful thing to see the love of a man and a woman for their children. As this love is expressed in a home that is reared itself to a standard above most of the world. For most of the world don't even know who their children are. They got this advertisement. It's 10 o'clock. Do you know where little Johnny is? And somebody comes back and says, Johnny who? Because they haven't seen him for 2 or 3 weeks. Somebody doesn't have any security because nobody knows where they are in life. Christ is our model of unfailing obedience. Though he were a son, yet learned he obedience by the things which he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the author of eternal salvation to all them that obey him. I don't know, but I imagine Judas Iscariot missed many lashes with the belt. I'm not sure, but there's a lot of times that people have not been loved sufficiently by their parents to be corrected. Their children are like uncontrolled animals. They don't have any discipline. They don't have any concern about anything anybody else has. They're not even worried what they're doing because they're off somewhere else doing something else. But what God has taught us is something that we must understand. Look at verse 32 of Romans, the first chapter. Paul writes and says, who, knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. It is often a sad commentary on a life of a child when it was not raised in a home that is revered by God, that doesn't remember seeing his dad bow his head in prayer, that was never invited to a Bible study by its parent, that didn't care if they got to Sunday school services or if they came on Wednesday night. And why is it the schools have started having all their events on Wednesday night? Is there some kind of an agreement in hell that every Wednesday night service has to be canceled? I understand that there's a lot of churches of Christ in the area that are contemplating not even having Wednesday night services. Why? It may be that on a Wednesday night, a person hears the gospel and decides to obey it. A child respects its parent and decides to become submissive to their will. That a man and his wife solved marital problems that they didn't realize was causing their destruction. Man, there's so many things that you can have happen to the good when you come to the services of the Lord. Why would anybody want to vacate a place where that good can be done? But the point I'm trying to make is this, and this alone. This is a short message, and I want you to understand it carries with it maybe your salvation. The Apostle Peter writes and says, fathers will be judged by the way they raise their children. Now you can tell me your wife don't want to come to services. You can tell me she don't believe and what we preach in the Church of Christ. You can tell me that her mother doesn't believe it and therefore runs a lot of confusion. Or you could tell me that the preaching is boring or the messages are not something you're interested in. You can give me every excuse in the book because I've already heard them. I don't need to have them reiterated. You can tell me everything you want to. I can tell you that didn't change this verse. Fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but train them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. Now, I don't want a man to beat his kids. I really never enjoyed whipping one of mine. I never got any jollies out of coming home and doing what my wife requested me to do. But if we're going to work as a team, the team had to work together. And as we raised our children to bring them to church services and to cause them to be servants of God, our desire was not to put on a show. Our desire was to put something within them that hell and the devil couldn't take out. And that was the fear of God. Because there's a time coming when this earth is going to be on fire. The heavens shall melt with a fervent heat, and the earth and the works therein shall be burned up. And seeing that these things are all being dissolved. Now listen, because you've not paid too much attention to this phrase. Seeing then that all these things are to be dissolved, what manner of men ought to be in all holy conversation and righteousness. If you don't get anything out of this study tonight, get this one thing. You permit it, you condone it, so don't complain about it. Don't let on like that your child is something from Mars that's uncorrectable or that's out of line that you can't bring in line. Because as God is my judge, He has demanded that we who are servants of God love our children and correct them so that they can be servants of God, and cause them to respect authority and never ever be in a position to be like those people that Enoch preached about in an antediluvian society. Because if you go there and you see that, what he says in verse 14 and 15, they were murmurers. You know what a murmurer is? You know what it means to talk back? My daddy had a pretty good sized hand, about like mine. And it always seemed that as I decided I was going to wise off or say something back to him, he was close enough to me. You ever heard that song, Ring My Bell, 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 Ring My Bell? And it helped me more than anything in this world if I was going to be disobedient to get out of his presence. But I didn't have the stupidity to do it while he was close, because he had no hesitancy in expressing love. It was amazing if you've never had a parent like this. And I did this to my children, so they were amazed too. I would be correcting one of them and whipping them, and I'd stop and say, now you know I do this because I love you. I don't know which one it was now, but one of them said, well, Daddy, just love me a little less. No, I can't, because it's the command of God that I'd follow, that He has stationed as a command of the fathers, as a gift that He demands they give to their children. Same thing's true about the command of God, salvation or anything else. You do what He says. You obey His commands. You do that because He's the best friend you've got in this world. Now, there's a lot of people that want to complain about what God says and what He means and what we understand. But God's the best friend you've ever had. And he's the best friend that I've ever had. And he's not going to give me some bad advice. And unlike human beings who are capable of making mistakes, he's not. And he's the one that put the father in the home, made him responsible for training his child, to allow that child to find peace with God in obedience to the gospel, and then final eternity with Christ in heaven by the power invested in the Father. Do you realize you have that much of a position in the child's life? Do you realize that this is what God has given you to do? Then love your child. Don't show no affection for it. When they keep asking, Daddy kept telling us, every time you disobey me, you're asking me to love you. Don't keep asking, let them ask you to love them. Show them the love that you have, and let them be servants of God. If you're here and need to respond to the invitation of the gospel, will you come as we stand and sing?